I went up to New York City yesterday, and you're familiar with Sean Tucker?
Yeah.
Okay. So he is doing some talks about his Meaning in the Making book in the US.
All
And
right.
I decided that I wanted to go up and meet him and see his talk and get inspired by him. So he was up in New York City last night, and he's doing another talk tonight. But it took me like a week and a half, to actually have the courage to decide that I'm going to do this.
Okay.
Because as a very introverted individual, it's difficult to get through that like anxiety. So the morning of yesterday, I was still deciding if I actually wanted to go and do this, despite knowing that it would be very inspiring, despite knowing that it would be beneficial to speak with him and to see this talk. And I finally decided that I needed to do this for myself, and I didn't want my anxiety to rule my life in that sense. And I wanted to prove to myself that I am bigger than my anxiety. And it was absolutely worthwhile going up there and seeing him. But it made for a very long day.
How far is it up to NY from you?
So it was about 2 hours to the ferry, because I took a ferry across from New Jersey right into the city instead of trying to drive into that madhouse. And so it was about 2 hours and then 10 minutes for the ferry across. So it wasn't too bad. It was just that I left at like 2:00 in the afternoon. Got there around 4 and got into New York around like 4:30 or so. And then I didn't get home until close to midnight.
I think I was 10 the last time I was in New York.
I try to avoid it as much as I can.
For sure.
Surprisingly enough, my anxiety wasn't too bad being there. Because I think there's something about the city that, at least for me, you don't feel like anybody cares about you. Like nobody in there or nobody there seems to like, they're all doing their own thing.
Yeah.
And there's obviously a lot of reassurance with that, but it's not at all a place that I'd like to spend a lot of time. So that's why yesterday I'm like, I'm just going to go for this talk and then I'm going to come home. I'm not going to spend the whole day there because I'd go insane.
Yeah, for sure. It's like I said, I live on a rock in the North Atlantic, and going into the local town of about 8,000 people feels like going to the city, and going to the mainland is a big deal now for me. It's I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's been some years since I've had that kind of anxiety now, probably 7 years maybe. I don't get that kind of anticipatory anxiety anymore. It's interesting looking in the rearview mirror and kind of thinking how that used to be. And like you said, in terms of how it can rule your life, they do say that the fear of fear is probably the most gripping anxieties that we can have. So yeah, I hear you, but it feels a little foreign to me now. I don't get that anymore, which I'm very grateful for.
Yeah.
But yeah, embracing your fears is certainly, this is why rock climbers are such inspiring public speakers. The people like Alex Honnold or Tommy Caldwell or, people like that, they're just incredibly inspiring people, because it is about overcoming fear and anxiety and performance anxiety and risk anxiety. What was it? Was it, who was it who said it? Was it, what was it? Yeah, I'm going to mix up my quotes in a moment, but there was two quotes. One is, whether you believe you can or whether you believe you can't, you're probably right. Which is basically saying if you think you can't do something, you're well on your way to failing. And the other one is, I think this was Hemingway, which is, I've endured some terrible times in my life and some of them actually happened.
Yeah.
Which is the kind of the same deal, which is the fear in your mind is often greater than actually the thing that you fear.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why, like, I just kept telling myself, like, I need to do this to prove to myself that I can do this. Because I know deep down that, like, it's really not that big of a deal to go into the city or to do anything. Like, I'm very capable of doing so, but my mind likes to tell me otherwise. And like
Totally.
you said, it's that fear itself. It's that fear of, well, what if this happens? But reality is that isn't going to happen,
Yeah, it's dangerous to and I think this is how we're all kind of wired differently. And people with creative minds can have very good imaginations. And this is the flip side of the coin of creativity, that you need a great imagination, or a great imagination can be beneficial to a creative person. But with that comes the flip side of the coin, which is you can imagine every conceivable hell in vivid detail, and pre-catastrophizing and allowing those thoughts to dominate our decision making, I think can be, well, debilitating for sure. And it's remarkable how quickly you can change that perspective, though. I mean, this is what CBT does: is it trains you to have different reactions to these visions or imaginings. But you can do this on your own. I mean, I always said, when I quit smoking like 20 plus years ago. And people have tons of difficulty, or used to have tons of difficulty quitting smoking. And I remember someone saying to me, "So what's the secret? How did you manage to quit smoking?" And it's like, every time I wanted one, I didn't have one. and that's it. And I think life is just a decision of those. It's almost a binary system. It's either a 1 or a 0. You either do something or you don't do something. And thinking very much falls into that binary map, which is, I believe something to be true, I believe something not to be true. And I think with our own mental health, we believe things to be true that are clearly not true. And that becomes conditioned thinking, and it becomes repetitive behavior. And repetitive behavior is another word for a habit. And habits can be very hard to kick, smoking, drinking, drugs, sex, whatever it might be that people become addicted to. And negative thinking is addictive. And it has all of the connotations and consequences that one would expect from other addictive behaviors, is that they are ultimately negative and controlling.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also that addiction of, like, for me, especially the past year or so, being in between figuring out job situation and all of that, and trying to figure out my life as a whole after having graduated college, it's been a lot of depressive episodes. And because of that, and because of the lack of dopamine and positivity in my mind, I reach for my phone constantly.
Yeah.
And it's that addiction to that dopamine kick, to getting at least some sort of feeling from social media or from watching YouTube videos, playing games, whatever it is, and spending hours on your phone just to feel like something. And that's just as much of an addiction as what drugs and alcohol can be.
100%.
It's just something that, I think a lot of people don't really believe that it's as much of an addiction as what it is, at least in the greater society. I think that's something that we're just beginning to better understand and to accept in a way, because it just doesn't feel like, or at least to some people, it doesn't seem like it feels as though being addicted to your phone or technology or to whatever, it could actually be something that's happening. Like, well, just put your phone down. Just put your phone away. Don't go on to it then. But a lot of people could be saying the same about alcohol or cigarettes. Just don't have one. And the reality is that addiction is a mental disorder, mental health issue. and you can be addicted to pretty much anything.
Sure.
Especially anything that especially is negative. So for me, it's a matter of trying to kick that and figure out different ways of kicking that habit of, I'm sitting here, I'm bored, I want to feel something at least somewhat positive, even if it's temporary. And so I'm going to reach for my phone and do something there instead of doing something productive that will give me more satisfaction in the long term, but in the short term, it's not going to feel as good.
Perhaps. I think you've raised a few points there that are really interesting. I think the first is how things are normalized. So social media has become a normalized part of life. And social media platforms love that, be that Meta or Google or other networks. So that normalization of something is always going to create that, well, it can't be that bad, surely, kind of attitude. I mean, alcohol is incredibly dominant in society. I actually quit drinking 100 days ago today, just to see if I could, as part of a broader health kick that I'm in right now, to get in better shape and, live longer and be healthier and all of those things. So the kind of normalizing of alcohol in society, the normalizing of social media in society, smoking has become kind of demonized, but vaping has taken over. So all of these things, but everything is, I'm going to use the word fractal, even though it's a crude term to kind of wrap all these different things up in. But if you have a negative relationship with alcohol or social media, that is going to mirror in negative relationships with other things, and this is why positivity tends to work very much in the opposite way, that the more positive relationships you have, the more likely you are to have a positive relationship with yourself, which is actually the number one relationship, is how we feel about ourselves. You have a negative relationship with yourself, you will tend to have negative relationships with other people and other things. So, it's like you can almost choose your martyr, and just take one of the things that you feel is suboptimal, whether that's, a phone addiction or not getting enough exercise or being bored, and change your attitude to that one thing. And then they tend to run on from each other. Positive decision making is in itself an addiction because it gives you positive feedback. So therefore it becomes a thing that you crave, is taking positive action. But these things can change. I mean, like I said, 8 years ago, for example, my mental health was appalling. I mean, we're talking the deepest pit type of mental health. And, living with all of those negative thoughts, like 24/7 and not being able to sleep and lying awake and panic attacks. And, that's unpleasant, and I lived like that for a long, long time. And if someone had said to me 8 years ago, you're going to have a time in your life in the future where you have a completely different relationship, not just with yourself, but the way you sit in the world, and you are not going to have to live with this, and you are going to sleep through the night, and you're going to be able to be positive and functional and all of these things, I would have just thought, no, that is not possible. I am a panicky person. I have poor mental health. I am that person. And I so heavily defined myself with that language that it is your worldview. That is your perception of who you are. And it's complete nonsense. Now, what I want to make sure that comes across here very, very clearly is there's a difference between poor mental health or negative health issues or negative mental health issues and mental illness. These are different things. Mental illness is a biological condition, but I think a lot of us who considered ourselves to have a mental health condition don't. We just have very, very poor relationships with our own minds. Terms and conditions apply.
Yeah, you're saying about how you define yourself reminds me of something that I believe Cal Newport said in his book, I think it was Deep Work, or maybe it was James Clear in Atomic Habits. It was James Clear in Atomic Habits. And he said that how we define ourselves is quite important, especially when we're trying to build habits or do much of anything in reality. But in the context of the book, he was saying that if you want to be someone who writes every day, you need to reframe your mind to say, I am someone who writes every day, instead of saying that you are, or if you're constantly telling yourself that I am this, you're going to believe that you are that. And I think that's the biggest difficulty when it comes to mental health, is that your mind is telling you all the time that you are this way. And even if it's temporary state of being, you are still going to you're going to believe it. And the more that you tell yourself, I am depressed, I am an anxious, panicky person, the more that you are going to believe it, and the worse it's going to become.
100%.
The more difficult that it's going to be to get out of that mind, or that frame of mind. And I think that's really what makes it so difficult for a lot of people, is to shift your thinking and to combat that thinking, because it can be so pervasive and so loud in your mind, and just difficult to get away from.
Yeah, 100%. It took me 25 years.
Yeah.
You know? And I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And I think it's important from my perspective these days is not to trivialize that. Not to trivialize. I mean, the last thing I want to do is make it sound as if, it's just all in our head, and we can just click our fingers and tap the ruby slippers together 3 times and make a wish, and everything's going to get better straight away. That is not the case. I mean, the journey, I'm going to use my term, my journey out of darkness was long and hard, but it was worth it. And I think that's part of the thing, is ownership. We have to take ownership for our own recovery, because, if somebody else does it for you, you always believe that it wasn't you. You only did it because of somebody else, or you only did it because you relied so heavily on somebody else. And I think taking ownership for anything and making it your victory is always going to be more profound and more powerful than someone giving you a solution. And I think this is where the marriage between our creativity and our creative output and our attitudes towards whatever it may be, image making or guitar playing or poetry writing or whatever it is we're doing, all of these things, is we have to have our own little victories, because then that's the way to break the wheel, is to suddenly realize, well, hey, wait a minute, I did that. I've changed my thinking. I have made myself happier through the power of my thinking, and it's a huge thing, But mental health problems are, they are what make us human. We think, therefore we're panicked. we think, therefore we're anxious. It's there's no shortage of things in the world today to be scared of, and some of those fears are rational and some of them are irrational. But most of the things we fear about ourselves, and I think this is where labeling, to come back to that, is so important, because when we're children, we get labeled really young. You go off to kindergarten or primary school or whatever, and instantly you're labeled, whether you're in set A or set B or whatever. And all of these labels, as we progress through our education and, further education, and then going to the workplace or our peer groups, we use labels all the time. And ultimately, most of those labels become a veneer that we hide behind, because we tend to suppress our true selves in most social circumstances, because we don't want people to think we're a jerk. We don't want people to hate us. We don't want people to challenge our beliefs and sensibilities and behaviors. So we tend to become a little bit vanilla in most situations. And I think this is where creativity can be a gateway through to a very, very different perspective and relationship with ourselves, in that the more one pursues integrity, creative integrity, the more likely one is to be expressing the true version of ourselves rather than the veneer. But like you said, the more you talk about who you are in negative terms, you tend to produce images then, using photography as an example, that are portraying the role, or they're perpetrating the veneer of who you want people to think you are. And that's a very, very different thing, because that in its own right can be negative too. So even though you're producing positive outcomes with people's feedback to your work, you're actually not being authentic to yourself, and you know it. Sorry, that was a notification on my computer. I should have turned those off.
It's okay.
But yeah, it's exciting. I mean, it's basically my life's work now is the relationship between creativity and changing behaviors and changing mental health. I mean, that is the most important thing in my work today.
Yeah, the labeling has been on and off my mind for a while. So for the longest time, I was calling myself a landscape photographer. And the realities of that is that my interests as an individual are constantly growing. And I think this goes for everyone. We are constantly being enamored by different subject matter, by different lighting situations. And it wasn't really until I was speaking with Chuck Kimmerly, doing a little photo review of some of my work, that he kind of pointed out that my strongest work is more in the fine art line of things, and not so much where it's focused on taking photographs of trees or of waterfalls, but rather of the sector where humanity meets nature, and more of that fine art sort of subject matter. And I thought that was interesting because, like I said, I had always labeled myself as a landscape photographer. And so it felt so wrong to me to go out and photograph these other things, let alone attempt to share them, because, well, that's not who I am. That's not who I'm trying to show the world that I am. But all the while, I'm denying my true self. I'm denying myself of the individual I could become and who I should become. And I think that goes not just with photography, but like you were saying, with everything, that we start to put labels on ourselves. We allow society to label ourselves, and instead we are being denied our potential. We're being denied what we could become. If you're constantly telling yourself that you are X, Y, and Z, then until you say otherwise, you will always be X, Y, and Z.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, we're both photographers, or, to use that term, we both use cameras to express ourselves. And on a superficial level, photography is a pastime. It's a recording tool. And at its best, it's a catalyst. I think photography at its absolute best is a catalyst, a conduit for us to truly explore who we are. And this the anecdote that you've just shared, regarding your true passion, I remember when I was in the depth of my despair, I was so desperate, I was like on Google asking, what's the meaning of life? And all of these kind of questions. And of course, you get the standard trite responses and all of that type of stuff. And it's worth it, and hold on, and all of that type of stuff. But the best one I ever read was the meaning of life is to be so wrapped up in passion that you don't have time to ask the question. And I loved that. I thought, yeah, so if you talk about passion for something is the elixir. That's the water of life, is passion. I think life without passion is a pretty depressing place. It's just, and some people get passionate for drinking, or some people get passionate for going to soccer or following a sports team or cinema or whatever. People get passionate for collecting stamps. And anyone with passion in their life is richer than someone without. Unless, of course, it's passion for drugs and things like that. I mean, they tend to have negative outcomes. They tend to be escape. But, I know people who are really into psychedelics, still, and their passion is to push the envelope. They are pushing the envelope of their own minds, and they do it with precision and intent, and in a quite a scientific manner. And that's very, very different from just dosing up. So you really truly can be passionate about anything. And I think it's the thing that enriches life. So, like you say, with phone addiction or social media addiction, replacing it with picking up a book and reading something is better, because it's a different relationship that you're having. But all of these they require intentionality, not, in that binary model that we talked about before. Making a decision not to do something and do something else is a very binary decision, and you only have to do it once, and then you're on a different path. So I think one of the things with mental health issues is that I think we tend to get wrapped up in the big picture too easily and too readily. It's just, the problem is too large for me to handle. The problem is too large for me to address. And this is where it has to be broken down. It literally starts with one decision, and then another decision, and then another decision. And each one of them comes easier. But, the way you've described it earlier in this conversation, it sounds like, there are times when the decisions that you're trying to make are wrapped up in too big a picture, and therefore they're hard for you. That's certainly what kind of came across earlier with what you were describing.
Yeah. The way that you talk about it makes it sound so easy, but there's also there's just the reality that addiction, once it has its claws into you, it can be very, very difficult to get away from. I mean, I was talking to David Kingham yesterday a bit about mental health and insecurities and all of this too. Something that I want to talk about in a minute here is how we should be more open about that as a community, especially. But before we get to that, I was saying to him that I want to write these articles. I want to read these books that I have. I mean, as the listeners know, I have over 140 books on my bookshelf right now that I want to get through. But it can be so difficult to pick up that book because, as I was saying earlier, there's that short-term versus long-term gratification. I mean, you pick up your phone and you're scrolling through social media and it's immediately gratifying. You're immediately getting those dopamine hits. Versus you're reading a book, and it may not be until you finish the book or you come across a certain chapter of the book that really resonates with you, that you get even close to that similar or same amount of dopamine, where you don't feel that gratification until a little bit later. You aren't like, if I sit down to write an article, I'm not getting anything positive from that until I've finished writing it. And then I feel good about myself for having finished it. And I more than likely feel better about myself having finished it than I would have if I had sat on my phone for that hour or 2 hours, however long it takes. But it's a matter of getting over that initial hump and pushing through that pain period, for lack of better words, where you can then get to see the light at the end of the tunnel and realize that, yes, this was worth doing. And I think that's a massive issue, is just recognizing that long-term gratification is ultimately going to be more satisfying than any sort of short-term will really ever be, especially when it comes to feeding your addiction and social media, etc.
It's a shame we're not on video here because I'm smiling my ass off here. It's really, it's actually really interesting because a lot of this stuff I haven't thought about for a while. And like I said, my life is so profoundly different now from how it was before. But I can still look back at the steps required to make that change. And one of the things that has been very evident in the language that you use to describe your relationship with dopamine and the expression short-term, long-term, medium-term is they are conditions of reward. You're basically saying, I am going to get a reward either now tomorrow, next week, or next month, or next year. And those timescales are self-imposed. And the relationship that you have with those rewards can be, well, basically they're another label. And secondly, they're another bar in the cage. I talk about the cage a lot, the cage that we create for ourselves, where each negative thought is a bar, and each negative experience, or each thing we carry forward from childhood or our younger years or our current situation, every single thing is a bar. And we create these cages for ourselves. And the majority of the bars do not need to exist. And putting a time label on a reward is a sure way of creating a bar. So what I did, now many people who listen to these may know my backstory and they may know who I am and stuff, but for those who don't, I spent 7 years living in Tibet, and I used to meditate a lot. And the thing about that is it redefined my definition of time, because I am not really interested in tomorrow. I'm not interested in when I finish an article. I'm interested in now. So I want to feel good now. I'm an instant gratification person. I am. Ask my wife. She will basically say, it's like I have got no patience for reward. I want it to be Christmas Day every day. Yeah, I don't want to wait until December. But it's not about gifts in terms of physical things. It's more of the mental gift that we can give ourselves every day. And by redefining what you define, by redefining what you basically think of as reward, because I get a lot of pleasure from writing an article as I'm writing it. Each sentence is an opportunity to exercise a thought. Because that's what we do when we make articles, is that we release them from our brains. And quite often I write in a way that is quite subconscious. I allow the article almost to write itself. Some people who've read my articles might notice that, that they tend to be quite impulsive. Does that make sense to you? That, thinking of, I am only going to feel good about myself when I'm finished that, versus I can actually enjoy the process of doing that, and therefore I can feel good about myself with every single word that I write. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, definitely. It's absolutely a point I would like to get to, and to redefine that mind frame, that mindset around things. It's just a matter of, I think a lot of people don't think about it like that.
No.
And because we don't think about it in such that manner, there are no like self-help books that are talking about that for the general public. It's always about that short-term, medium-term, long-term gratification and pushing through that initial hump. But I think that it would absolutely be more beneficial for people to be able to recognize the joy of writing a single sentence, like you say, in an article, and enjoying every single moment of that period, of that activity.
It's profound. It really is, and people, the word mindfulness has become so common now. It's been normalized, and it's become such a celebrity thing, or it's become such a mainstream thing that people it gets kind of diminished in the public eye, because most people don't do it. Most people, they give it a little try, and they think that they're, achieving something. But in its purest form, when you can savor an individual breath and experience those moments of oneness, God, I sound so hippie now. When you can experience that total stillness of your being, and realizing that every thought in your brain is not you, it's purely thought, and that as soon as you don't have to identify with those thoughts, and that you can savor a breath. I mean, one of the things that all humans share is that for a certain amount of time we breathe, and then we don't. And that transition from being a breathing thing to a non-breathing thing is pretty profound, right? And one of the things I always talk about is like, we're racing into the future. It's like, oh, I'll be happy when. I'll be happy when I've achieved this. I'll be happy when I've finished that article. I'll be happy when I've lost X amount of weight and I can run a marathon. I'll be happy when I've got a bigger car or a fancier house. Or we have all of these I'll be happy when statements. I'll be happy when I find the love of my life. XYZ statements. And we're racing into the future. And the only thing that's waiting for us in the future is that time when we go through that transition from being breathing things to non-breathing things. And I don't want to be a non-breathing thing. I want to be a breathing thing, right? So when you start thinking about the value of a breath, it's pretty huge. Yeah. The fact that we can breathe oxygen into our bodies and we can move around and we can think and we can do and we can love and we can care and we can have empathy and compassion and, we can build relationships with meaning and we can share our experiences and perspectives to help other people. All of these things that we can do, yet we choose to focus on, oh my God, I feel so bad. I have such negative image of myself. I'm not as good as that person. It's like me sitting in my office and thinking, I'm not a bad runner, but hey, Usain Bolt's really good. It's like, and this is the thing with photography and the creative arts. And it was the same when I picked up my guitar for the first time at the age of 14. I wanted to be Dave Gilmour. I wanted to be Jimmy Page. I wanted to play the instrument to that level immediately. And it's the same with photography. People go out and buy a camera and they want to be Ansel Adams or, as insert name of someone whose photography you admire. They want to be Jennifer Renwick, like tomorrow. And they're unrealistic expectations, and unrealistic expectations lead to disappointment. They lead to negativity. They lead to negative outcomes. And this is why, the paradigm shift between being a human and being a creative human and being a true version of yourself is incredibly difficult because everything in the world is trying to stop you from doing that. And that is the number one barrier, is the way we are educated, the way society works, the way that capitalism works. All of these things are ultimately driving us down a corridor into a blind alley to be a thing, a version of a human that we might not necessarily want to be, and certainly won't harness and nourish and nurture the kind of the values that we have that nobody knows. Anyway, that's my little hippie spiel over.
No, but that touches right on insecurity too. The insecurities that we have about ourselves when we don't achieve that immediate success, when we don't immediately become the Ansel Adam that we want to be, or the Jimmy Page or anyone else when it comes to our creative outlets. We look at the individuals who are, in our eyes, in our view, more successful in a shorter period of time, at least how we see it. And we think, why can't we have that? Why didn't we get that the same? Why aren't we able to work as hard or be as diligent or productive as what this individual is?
You're too busy on your phone, buddy.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Put your phone down and do something else.
Yeah, tell me about it. But like I was saying earlier, I was talking to David Kingham about this, and him and I both have our struggles with insecurities, and I think that a lot of, if not most of us, do. But it's something
if you're creative, if you're truly creative, I think that it comes with the turf. We should be insecure about our creativity. Now, overcoming that is incredibly difficult. I think the best you can strive for is ambivalence in terms of our own creativity. I struggle to feel good about my own creativity, but I try not to let that get in the way. But yeah, I hear you. Insecurity. Any artist who's not insecure is essentially arrogant, and no one likes that, I don't think.
I'll push back on that a little bit though, because I don't think that it's necessarily an arrogance depending on it. I think we can get to a point where we recognize that yes, our art may not be Like, obviously, we don't want to think that we are the best in the world. We don't want to be the Peter Lick of the photography community. But at the same time,
I'd like to be the Peter Lick of the photography community.
Well,
I could do with 200 million in my bank account.
But I think that we can get to a point where we are happy with the work that we are creating, that we are pleased with what we are doing in our creative lives, without getting to a point of arrogance. I think the biggest issue, though, is that like I said, we see these other people doing work that we would like to be doing, and we compare ourselves to them, and we get to a point where we immediately become down on ourselves because we aren't them. And that's something that's like the common keeping up with the Joneses of trying to be the same, have the same car as your neighbor, or make as much money as what your neighbor does, and constantly comparing to one another. I mean, that's the capitalist dream. That's what keeps it all alive, is the fact that if we weren't constantly looking at what somebody else has and thinking, oh, I want that too, then the world would be quite a different place. And I think the same can be said when it comes to creativity and when it comes to photography. But it's a matter of getting to that point where we become more open, like this conversation here, about our mental health struggles, about our insecurities when it comes to things. It's something that I try and push in everything that I do in talking so openly. And I think more people should, because as I was saying to somebody else too, everybody's story has worth in it. And I think sharing those stories can help each other relate. But I think that a lot of people will look at what you and I are talking about and say, oh, well, my struggles aren't as bad as theirs are, and so mine don't have worth. But I think quite the opposite, that everybody needs to or should be talking more openly about what we're going through in order to help normalize that this is okay to be going through, but we don't have to be going through it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Again, we've raised, or you've raised quite a few points in that that part of the conversation. I think when I was talking about arrogance, it was more. There are arrogant photographers out there. There are people who think, I'm amazing at this. And
of course,
that's not an attractive trait in most people. Most of the most of the photographers who I consider to be significant in the contemporary scene are very, very quiet, modest people. Almost nobody shouts terribly loud about how good they think they are. That concept of goodness to me has become quite irrelevant. I don't consider my work in those terms anymore. Like the body of work I put together for Out of Darkness, I kind of recognize it as a significant body of work, but at the same time, it doesn't define who I am, any more than going out and making a new photograph tomorrow would do. So I don't tend to label the images as having more worth than other images, for example. But I think authenticity and integrity and creating from a sincere place are really important. So an image can have value to me that I don't need to share it with somebody else because it's just for me. Whereas images that we share, you're almost, there has to be an intention for sharing. Sometimes we share because, like this conversation you and I are having, we're sharing this conversation because it might allow someone listening to think, hey, wait a minute, these guys are talking about these things and I resonate with these, and I recognize these attributes in myself. And if these guys can do it, then means I can do it too. Now, it's not about offering solutions. So sharing images can be the same. It's like, some people aren't very good at articulating their feelings, but they can share an image with a small narrative that goes along with it, that allows somebody else to say, well, if he can do that, then I can do that. So, the whole, again, how we feel about our work is another label. And increasingly, I try to just eradicate them. in every avenue of my life, I try to eradicate labels, good, bad, better, worse, rich, poor, healthy, unhealthy. I try to just make better choices in things that I try to do. And that is every day. It's a 24/7 discipline. But I 100% agree that having these conversations should be normal. But I do also think that in particular with mental health and our own creativity is that we can overthink. We can over dissect. We can overlearn. You have no idea how many mental health related meditation books are on my Kindle. I mean, we are talking, probably hundreds, all of which I have read. And how many do I read now? 0. I never read a book on mental health, self-help, personal development. I just don't read them anymore because we tend to focus on the negatives. And a lot of that can actually reinforce our belief that there is something wrong with us. I think finding a positive outlet is probably more healthy than overly researching negatives. That's my rear view mirror hindsight. Is I could have saved myself a whole bunch of grief by not overly researching this stuff. Because a lot of them are focusing on the negatives and they're reinforcing the negative. And you don't know until you finish reading it that it's actually made you worse. So I think there's a danger in overly focusing on negatives. I think if you're a panicky, anxious, depressed person, waking up every day and thinking, oh my God, I'm depressed. Oh my God, I'm anxious. Oh my God, I'm depressed, like a mantra, there's only going to be one outcome on that day. And I think each day that we wake up, we have a fresh opportunity to change that.
Yeah, definitely.
There might be an underlying gurgling going on. I skipped lunch, so I'm. I don't know if it's coming across on the mic, but I am gurgling to quite a heavy extent.
I haven't noticed anything.
Okay, good.
But I think we can wrap it up there for now.
Okay, man.
I think that's pretty good without repeating ourselves,
It is easy to do.
Yes, exactly.
But just by way of a summary, I do believe that we all have the capacity to change who we are. Now, one of the interesting things about it is the more conscious one is about making that change, the more likely we're going to try to change ourselves into something that we imagine we want to be. And quite often that is just another blind alley. Because what I tried to do that for many years to become a better version of me. And I actually did become a different person, but it wasn't who I really am. I was successful and I did lots of great things, but I wasn't who I am today, which came about by a much more unconscious, allowing state to actually become who I am now. And that was a very, very different process. And it's full of surprises. And one of the great things about creativity is that once one can surprise oneself, then you're onto something. When you do something, it's like, wow, that's kind of cool. But it's like you can't intellectualize creativity and you can't intellectualize your personal development other than, striving for, goals of, a certain type of qualification or whatever. But on a subconscious level, allowing it to evolve is a much more interesting way of doing it. But I just talk too much. That's my problem.
Yeah, no, yeah. A lot to think about already this morning.
Yeah, I'm lucky. It's nearly 3 p.m. here. So, but yeah, I mean, sometimes overthinking is not helpful. Finding something cool to do is far more fun. I've recently set up a new music recording studio in the house, and I'm just having a blast, just making weird noises and creating beats and making weird trippy loops, and it's just stick on a pair of really nice headphones and lose yourself in 3D space, and it's really interesting. So I do that instead of looking at social media. I can't remember the last time I actually posted on social media. I'm terrible at it now.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that when we were recording the interview with David.
Yeah.
I thought it was funny too when I met Sean last night after we got talking for a little bit. He just, and you could tell that it was almost instinctual, but it was one of those like, oh, what's your Instagram? Like, we'll connect on Instagram. Kind of deal. I'm like, oh, I'm not on it. Like, I'm not on social media. And he had like that sort of reaction of like, good for you kind of thing. And not that he views social media as this super negative thing, but just that it's a necessity for him based on how he's built everything. And for him to keep posting is a necessity. But I still found that just immediate reaction of, I'm going to connect with you on social media. I'm going to connect with you on Instagram. I'll follow you on Instagram to see more of your work kind of thing. I found that to be fascinating rather than asking for a website or we had already connected through email, but asking for a website to see the work instead is interesting.
Yeah. If a big ton of money appears in my bank account this year, then I will be off social media faster than I can click delete. It's I'm not very good at it, and it's but again, I just feel talking about my own work and promoting my own work is uncomfortable. I don't really enjoy it. It's not why I make images, and it's not why I want to share images. So we have our own ways of trying to navigate that problem, but it is a necessary curse for most of us.
Yeah.
But anyway, I've enjoyed the chat, man. It's been great to catch up.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed our creative banter. You can learn more about Cody's work by visiting his website, codyschultz.com. And you can find my work at benhorn.com. For further discussion, join us at patreon.com/creativebanter. It's a place where we can interact with you, the listener. And although we greatly appreciate those who contribute by joining a tier, discussions are open to everyone, whether you're a paying member or not. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you around next time.